bringing you a southern perspective on books, movies, music, and much, much more. Stick around for a while, you just might hear something wicked. And welcome back. So let's get back into reading our brave deed for the day. And this one is going to be The Exploits of Douglas and Randolph, from The Tales of a Grandfather by Sir Walter Scott. When King Edward I heard that Scotland was again in arms against him, he marched down to the borders, as I have already told you, with many threats of what he would do to avenge himself on Bruce and his party, whom he called rebels. But he was now old and feeble, and while he was making his preparations, he was taken very ill, and after lingering a long time, at length died on the 6th of July, 1307, at a place in Cumberland called Burgh, upon the sands, in full sight of Scotland, not 3 miles from its frontier. His hatred to that country was so inveterate that his thoughts of revenge seemed to occupy his mind on his deathbed. He made his son promise never to make peace with Scotland until the nation was subdued. He gave also very singular directions concerning the disposal of his dead body. He ordered that it should be boiled in a cauldron till the flesh parted from the bones, and that then the bones should be wrapped up in a bull's hide and carried at the head of the English army as often as the Scots attempted to recover their freedom. He thought that he had inflicted such disease or distress on the Scots and invaded and defeated them so often that his very dead bones would terrify them. His son Edward II did not choose to execute this strange injunction, but caused his father to be buried in Westminster Abbey, where his tomb is still to be seen, bearing for an inscription, "Here lies the hammer of the Scottish nation. Edwardus Egonus, Sculptorum Malleus hic est." And indeed, it was true that during his life he did them as much injury as a hammer does to the substances which it dashes to pieces. Edward II was neither so brave nor so wise as his father. On the contrary, he was a weak prince, fond of idle amusements, and worthless favourites. It was lucky for Scotland that such was his disposition. He marched a little way into Scotland, to Cumnock, on the frontiers of Ayrshire, do forgive my pronunciation, with a large army which Edward I had collected, but went back again without fighting, which gave great encouragement to Bruce's party. Several of the Scottish nobility now took arms in different parts of the country, declared for King Robert, and fought against the English troops and garrisons. The most distinguished of these was the good Lord James of Douglas, whom we have often mentioned before. Some of his most memorable exploits respected his own castle of Douglas, in which, being an important fortress and strongly situated, the English had placed a large garrison. James of Douglas saw, with great displeasure, his castle filled with English soldiers and stored with great quantities of corn and cattle and wine and ale and other supplies which they were preparing, to enable them to assist the English army with provisions. So he resolved, if possible, to be revenged upon the captain of the garrison and his soldiers. For this purpose, Douglas went in disguise to the house of one of his old servants, called Thomas Dixon, a strong, faithful, and bold man, and laid a scheme for taking the castle. A holiday was approaching called Palm Sunday. Upon this day, it was common in the Roman Catholic times that the people went to church in procession, with green boughs in their hands. Just as the English soldiers who had marched down from the castle got into church, one of the Lord James's followers raised the cry of "Douglas! Douglas!" which was a shout with which the families always began battle. Thomas Dixon and some friends whom he had collected instantly drew their swords and killed the first Englishman whom they met. But as the signal had been given too soon, Dixon was borne down and slain. Douglas and his men presently forced their way into the church, and the English soldiers attempted to defend themselves, but being taken by surprise and unprepared, they were, for the greater part, killed or made prisoners, and that so suddenly, with so little noise, that their companions in the castle never heard it. So that when Douglas and his men approached the castle gate, and they found it open, and that part of the garrison, which were left at home, busied cooking provisions for all those who were at church. So Lord James got possession of his own castle without difficulty, and he and his men ate up all the good dinner which the English had made ready. But Douglas dared not stay there, lest the English should come in great force and besiege them, and therefore he resolved to destroy all the provisions which the English had stored up in the castle, and to render the place unavailing to them. It must be owned he executed this purpose in a very cruel and shocking manner, for he was so much enraged at the death of Thomas Dixon, he caused all the barrels containing flour, meal, wheat, and malt to be knocked in pieces, and their contents mixed on the floor. And then he staved a great hogshead of wine and ale and mixed the liquor with the stores. And last of all, he killed his prisoners and flung the dead bodies among the disgusting heap, in which his men called, in derision of the English, the Douglas larder. Then he flung the dead horses into the well to destroy it, after which he set fire to the castle and finally marched away and took refuge with his followers in the hills and forests. He loved better, he said, to hear the lark sing than the mouse squeak. That is, he loved better to keep in the open field with his men than to shut himself and them up in the castles. When Clifford, the English general, heard what had happened, he came to Douglas Castle with a great body of men, and rebuilt all the defences which Lord James had destroyed, and cleared out the well, and put a good soldier named Thirlwall to command the garrison, and desired him to be on his guard, for he suspected that Lord James would attack again. And indeed, Douglas, who did not like to see the English in his father's castle, was resolved to take the first opportunity of destroying this garrison, as he had done the former. For his purpose, he again had recourse to stratagem. He laid a part of his followers in ambush in the wood, and sent 14 men disguised like countrymen, driving the cattle past the gates of the castle. As soon as Thirlwall saw this, he swore that he would plunder the Scots drovers of their cattle, and came out with a considerable part of his garrison for that purpose. He had followed the cattle past the place where Douglas was lying concealed, and when all of a sudden the Scotsmen threw off their carriers' cloaks, and appearing in armor, cried the cry of Douglas, and turned back suddenly, ran to meet the pursuers, and before Thirlwall could make any defense, he heard the war cry behind him, and saw Douglas coming up with those Scots who had been lying in ambush. Thirlwall himself was killed, fighting bravely in the middle of his enemies, and only a very few of his men found their way back to the castle. When Lord James had thus slain 2 English commanders or governors of his castle, and was known to have made a vow that he would be revenged on any one who would dare to take possession of his father's house, men became afraid, and the fortress was called, both in England and Scotland, the perilous castle of Douglas, because it proved so dangerous to any Englishman who was stationed there. Now, in those warlike times, Master Littlejohn, you must know that the ladies would not marry any man who was not very brave and valiant, so that a coward, let him be ever so rich or high-born, was held in universal contempt, and thus it became the fashion for the ladies to demand proofs of the courage of their lovers, and for those knights who desired to please the ladies to try some extraordinary deed of arms to show their bravery and deserve their favor. At the time we speak of, there was a young lady in England whom many knights and noblemen asked in marriage, because she was extremely wealthy and very beautiful. Once upon a holiday she made a great feast, to which she asked all her lovers and numerous other gallant knights, and after the feast she arose and told them that she was much obliged to them for their good opinion of her, but as she desired to have for her husband a man of the most incontestable bravery, she had formed her resolution not to marry anyone, save one who should show his courage by defending the perilous castle of Douglas against the Scots for a year and a day. Now this made some silence among the gentlemen present, for although the lady was rich and beautiful, yet there was great danger in placing themselves within the reach of the good Lord James of Douglas. At last a brave young knight started up and said that for the love of that lady he was willing to keep the perilous castle for a year and a day, if the king was pleased to give him leave. The King of England was satisfied and well pleased to get a brave man to hold a place so dangerous. Sir John Wilton was the name of this gallant knight. He kept the castle very safely for some time, but Douglas at last, by a stratagem, this stratagem was, in its contrivance, a success, the same as his former one, save that in place of cattle driving, Sir James made 14 of his men take so many sacks and fill them with grass, as if corn, for the country market town of Lanark, distant 12 miles from the castle of Douglas. See instructions, Castle Dangerous, Waverley Novels, Volume 17. Or no, wait, 14, 16. Waverley Novels, Volume 16, 17. I don't know, XIVII, that's 11 and 7, so that would be 18, I suppose. I don't know, we'll have to find the Waverley Novels then. But Douglas at last had it, by stratagem, induced him to venture out with a part of the garrison, and then set upon them, and slew them. Sir John Wilton himself was killed, and a letter from the lady was found in his pocket. Douglas was very sorry for this unhappy end, and did not put to death any of the prisoners as he had formerly done, but dismissed them in safety to the next English garrison. Other great lords besides Douglas were now exerting themselves to attack and destroy the English. Amongst those was Sir Thomas Randolph, whose mother was a sister of King Robert. He had joined with the Bruce when he first took up arms, afterward being made prisoner by the English when the king was defeated at Methven. As I told you, Sir Thomas Randolph was obliged to join the English to save his life. He remained so constant to them that he was in company with the Emir de Valiance, and John of Lorne, when they forced the Bruce to disperse his little band, and he followed the pursuit so close that he made his uncle's standard-bearer prisoner, and took his banner. Afterwards, however, he was himself made prisoner at a solitary house on Linwater. The Lynn falls into the Tweed, a little above Peebles, by the good Lord James Douglas, who brought him captive to the king. Robert reproached his nephew for having deserted his cause, and Randolph, who was very hot-tempered, answered insolently, was sent by King Robert to prison shortly after. The uncle and nephew were reconciled, and Sir Thomas Randolph, created Earl of Murray by the king, was ever afterwards one of Bruce's best supporters. There was a sort of rivalry between Douglas and him, which should do the boldest and most hazardous actions. I will just mention one or two circumstances which will show you what awful dangers were to be encountered by these brave men in order to free Scotland from its enemies and invaders. And we have a small illustration of the invaders. So, while Robert Bruce was gradually getting possession of the country and driving out the English, Edinburgh, the principal town of Scotland, remained with its strong castle in possession of the invaders. Sir Thomas Randolph was extremely desirous to gain this important place, but as you well know, the castle is situated on a very steep and lofty rock, so that it is difficult or almost impossible even to get up to the foot of the walls, much more to climb over them. So while Randolph was considering what was to be done, there came to him a Scottish gentleman named Francis, who had joined Bruce's standard and asked to speak with him in private. He then told Randolph that in his youth he had lived at the castle of Edinburgh, and that his father had then been keeper of the fortress. It happened at that time that Francis was much in love with a lady who lived in a part of the town beneath the castle, which is called the Grass Market. Now, as he could not get out of the castle by day to see his mistress, he had practiced a way of clambering by night down the castle rock on the south side, and returning at his pleasure. And when he came to the foot of the wall, he made use of a ladder to get over it, as it was not very high at that point, those who built it having trusted to the steepness of the crag, and for the same reason, no watch was placed there. Francis had gone and come so frequently in this dangerous manner, that though it was now long ago, he told Randolph he knew the road so well, that he would undertake a guide to a small party of men by night to the bottom of the wall. And as they might bring ladders with them, there would be no difficulty in scaling it. The great risk was that their being discovered by the watchmen while in the act of ascending the cliff, in which case every man of them must have perished. Nevertheless, Randolph did not hesitate to attempt the adventure. He took with him only 30 men. You may be sure that they were chosen for activity and courage, and came one dark night to the foot of the rock. which they began to ascend under the guidance of Francis, who went before them upon his hands and feet, up one cliff, down another, and round another, where there was scarce room to support themselves. All the while, these 30 men were obliged to follow in a line, one after another, by a path that was fitter for a cat than a man. The noise of a stone falling or a word spoken from one to another would have alarmed the watchmen. They were obliged, therefore, to move with the greatest precaution. When they were far up the crag and near the foundation of the wall, they heard the guards going their rounds to see that all was safe in and about the castle. Randolph and his party had nothing for it but to lie close and quiet, each man under the crag, as he happened to be placed, and trust that the guards would pass by without noticing them. And while they were waiting in breathless alarm, they got a new cause for fright. One of the soldiers of the castle, willing to startle his comrades, suddenly threw a stone from the wall and cried, "Aha! I see you well." The stone came thundering down over the heads of Randolph and his men, who naturally thought themselves discovered. If they had stirred or made the slightest noise, they would have been entirely destroyed, for the soldiers above might have killed every man of them merely by rolling down stones. But being courageous and chosen men, they remained quiet, and the English soldiers, who thought their comrade was merely playing them a trick, as indeed he had no other meaning in what he did, and said, "Pass on without further examination." Then Randolph and his men got up and came in haste to the foot of the wall, which was not above twice a man's height in that place. They planted the ladders they had brought, and Francis mounted first to show them the way. Sir Andrew Grey, a brave knight, followed him. Randolph himself was third man who got over. Then the rest followed. When once they were within the walls, there was not so much to do, for the garrison were asleep and unarmed, excepting the watch, who were speedily destroyed. Thus was Edinburgh Castle taken in March 1312 to 13. It was not, however, only by the exertion of great and powerful barons like Randolph and Douglas that the freedom of Scotland was to be accomplished. The stout yeomanry and the bold peasantry of the land, who were as desirous to enjoy their cottages in honourable independence as the nobles were to reclaim their castles and estates from the English, contributed their full share in the efforts which were made to deliver their country from the invaders. I will give you one instance among many. There was a strong castle near Linlithgow, or Lithgow, as the word is more generally pronounced, where an English governor with a powerful garrison lay in readiness to support the English cause, and used to exercise much severity upon the Scots in the neighbourhood. Excuse me. There lived at no great distance from the stronghold a farmer, a bold and stout man whose name was Bivouac, or as it is now pronounced, Benning. This man saw with great joy the progress which the Scots were making in recovering their country from the English, and resolved to do something to help his countrymen by getting possession, if it were possible, of the castle of Lithgow. But the place was very strong, situated by the side of the lake, defended not only by gates, which were usually kept shut against strangers, but also by a portcullis. A portcullis is a sort of door formed of crossbars of iron, like a grate. It has not hinges like a door, but it is drawn up by pulleys, and let down when any danger approaches. It may be let go in a moment, and then falls into the doorway. And as it has great iron spikes at the bottom, it crushes all that it lights upon. Thus, in case of a sudden alarm, a portcullis may be let suddenly fall to defend the entrance, when it is not possible to shut the gates. Bennet knew this very well, but he resolved to be provided against this risk also when he attempted to surprise the castle. So he spoke with some bold, courageous countrymen and engaged them in his enterprise, which he accomplished thus. Bennet had been accustomed to supply the garrison of Linlithgow with hay, and he had been ordered by the English governor to furnish some cartloads of which they were in want. He promised to bring it accordingly, but the night before he drove the hay to the castle. He stationed a party of his friends as well armed as possible near the entrance, where they could not be seen by the garrison, and gave them directions that they should come to his assistance as soon as they could hear him cry a signal, which was to be, "Call all, call all." Then he loaded a great wagon with hay, but in the wagon he placed 8 strong men, well armed, lying flat on their breasts and covered over with hay so that it could not be seen. He himself walked carelessly beside the wagon, and he chose the stoutest and bravest of his servants to be the driver, who carried at his belt a strong axe or hatchet. In this way, Bennet approached the castle nearly early in the morning, and the watchmen, who only saw 2 men, Bennet being one of them, with a cart of hay, which they expected, opened the gates and raised up the portcullis to permit them to enter the castle. But as soon as the cart had gotten under the gateway, Bennet made a sign to his servant, who with his axe suddenly cut asunder the sowum, that is, the yoke which fastens the horses to the cart, and the horses, finding themselves free, naturally started forward, the cart remaining behind under the arch of the gate. And at the same moment, Bennet cried as loud as he could, "Call all, call all!" And drawing the sword, which he had under his country habit, he killed the porter. The armed men then jumped up from under the hay where they had been concealed, and rushed on the English guard. The Englishmen tried to shut the gates, but they could not, because the cart of hay remained in the gateway, and prevented the folding doors from being closed. The portcullis was also let fall, but the grating caught on the cart, and so could not drop to the ground. The men who were in ambush near the gate, hearing the cry, "Call all," ran to assist those who had leapt out from amongst the hay. The castle was taken, and all the Englishmen killed or made prisoners. King Robert rewarded Bennet by bestowing on him an estate, which his posterity long afterwards enjoyed. Perhaps you may be tired, my dear child, of such stories. Yet I will tell you of how great an import the castle of Roxburgh was taken from the English, and then we will pass to other subjects. For you must know Roxburgh was then a very large castle, situated near 2 fine rivers, the Tweed and the Teviot, joining each other. Being within 5 or 6 miles of England, the English were extremely desirous of retaining it, and the Scots equally eager to obtain possession of it. I will tell you how it was taken. It was upon the night of what is called Shrove Tide, a holiday which Roman Catholics paid great respect to the solemnized with much gaiety and feasting. Most of the garrison of Roxburgh Castle were drinking and carousing, but still they had yet set watches on the battlements of the castle, in case any sudden attack, for, as the Scots had succeeded so many enterprises of the kind, and as Douglas was known to be in the neighbourhood, they conceived themselves obliged to keep a very strict guard. An Englishwoman, the wife of one of the officers, was sitting on the battlements with her child in her arms, and looking out on the fields below. She saw some black objects, like a herd of cattle, straggling near the foot of the wall, and approaching the ditch or the moat of the castle. She pointed them out to the sentinel, and asked him what they were. "Pooh-pooh," said the soldier. "It is a farmer, and such as one's cattle," naming a man whose farm lay near the castle. "The good man is keeping a jolly shrove tide, and has forgot to shut up his bullocks in their yard. But if the Douglas come across them before morning, he is likely to rue his negligence." Now these creeping objects, which they saw from the castle wall, were no real cattle, but Douglas himself and his soldiers, who had put black cloaks above their armor, and were creeping about on hands and feet, in order, without being observed, to get so near to the foot of the castle wall as to be able to set ladders to it. The poor woman, who knew nothing of this, sat quietly on the wall and began to sing to her child. You must know that the name of Douglas had become so terrible to the English that the woman used to frighten their children with it, and say to them, when they behaved ill, that they would make the black Douglas take them. And this soldier's wife was singing to her child, "Hush ye, hush ye, little pet ye, hush ye, hush ye, do not fret ye, the black Douglas shall not get ye." "You are not so sure of that," said a voice close beside her. She felt at the same time a heavy hand with an iron glove laid on her shoulder, and when she looked around, she saw the very black Douglas she had been singing about, standing close beside her, a tall, swarthy, strong man. At the same time, another Scotsman had been ascending the walls near to the sentinel. The soldier gave the alarm and rushed at the Scotman, whose name was Simon Ladyhouse, with his lance, but Simon parried the stroke, and closing with the sentinel, struck him a deadly blow with his dagger. The rest of the Scots followed up to assist Douglas and Ladyhouse, and the castle was taken. Many of the soldiers were put to death, but Douglas protected the woman and the child. I dare say she made no more songs about the black Douglas. While Douglas, Randolph, and other true-hearted patriots were thus taking castles and strongholds from the English, King Robert, who had now a considerable army under his command, marched through the country, beating and dispersing such bodies of English as he met on his way. He went to the north country, where he conquered the great and powerful family of Comyn, who retained strong ill will against him for having slain their relation, the Red Comyn, in the church at Dumfries. They had joined the English with all their forces, but now, as the Scots began to get the upper hand, they were very much distressed. Bruce caused more than 30 of them to be beheaded in one day, and the place where they are buried is called the grave of the headless Comyns. Neither did Bruce forget or forgive John MacDougall of Lorne, who had defeated him at Dowry, and very nearly made him prisoner or slain him by the hands of his vassals, the Androssers, and had afterward pursued him with a bloodhound. When John of Lorne heard that Bruce was marching against him, he hoped to defend himself by taking possession of a very strong pass on the side of one of the largest mountains in Scotland, Cruachan Ben. The ground was very straight, having lofty rocks on the one hand, and on the other deep precipices, sinking down on a great lake called Loch Awe, so that John of Lorne thought himself perfectly secure, as he could not be attacked except in front and by a very difficult path. But King Robert, when he saw how his enemies were posted, sent a small party of light-armed archers under command of Douglas, with directions to go by a distant and difficult road around the northern side of the hill, and thus to attack the men of Lorne in the rear as well as in the front, that is, behind, as well as before. He had signals made when Douglas arrived at the place appointed. The king then advanced upon Lorne men in front, when they raised a shout of defiance and began to shoot arrows and roll stones down the path with great confidence in the security of their own position. But when they were attacked by the Douglas and his archers in the rear, the soldiers of MacDougall lost courage and fled. Many were slain among the rocks and precipices, and many were drowned in the lake and the great river which runs out of it. John of Lorne only escaped by means of his boat, which he had in readiness upon the lake. Thus King Robert had full revenge upon him, and deprived him of a great part of his territory. The English now possessed scarcely any piece of importance in Scotland, except Stirling, which was besieged, or rather blockaded, by Edward Bruce, the king's brother. To blockade a town or castle is to quarter an army around it, so as to prevent those within from getting provisions. This was done by the Scots before Stirling, till Sir Philip Mowbray, who commanded the castle, finding that he was like to be reduced to extremity for want of provisions, made an agreement with Edward Bruce that he would surrender the place, providing he were not relieved by the King of England before midsummer. Sir Edward agreed to these terms and allowed Mowbray to go to England, or to London, to tell King Edward of the conditions he had made. But when King Robert heard that what his brother had done, he thought it was too great a risk, since it obliged him to venture a battle with the full strength of Edward II, who had under him England, Ireland, Wales, and a great part of France, and could within the time allowed assemble a much more powerful army than the Scots could. Even if all Scotland were fully under the king's authority, Sir Edward answered his brother with his naturally audacious spirit, "Let Edward bring every man as he has. We will fight them, were they more." The king admired his courage, though it was mingled with rashness. "Since it is so, brother," he said, "we will manfully abide battle, and assemble all who love us, and value the freedom of Scotland, to come with all the men they have, and help us to oppose King Edward, should he come with his army to rescue Stirling." And that is the end of our brave deed for today. And we have another illustration. That's why I like these books. The illustrations have the text wrapped around them. It's very nice. It's old school. You don't see stuff like this anymore. There's riding on his horse across the plains. Alright, so that is our brave deed. And next Tuesday, we've already covered Pocahontas. We will be covering Ned Osborne's Leap, which is a different author. So it won't be the same writer as Bruce and today's. It won't be Sir Walter Scott. It will be one different. Clara M. Mattoll. So we shall look forward to that next week. and we'll see you right after this break. And welcome back to Tuesday Playlist. So it's time. Eothen. Let's see what he got into this time. If you remember, last time he had encountered the monks of Palestine, and that he had went through Galilee, and the fleas there weren't so nice. So we're going to continue now. I have no idea how to pronounce this, so do forgive me my shitty pronunciation on some things. Chapter 12. My first Bivouac. Bivouac. The course of Jordan is from the north to the south, and in that direction, with very little of devious windings, it carries the shining waters of Galilee straight down into the solitudes of the Dead Sea. Speaking roughly, the river in that meridian is a boundary between the people living under roofs and the tented tribes that wander on the farther side. And so, as I went down in my way from the Tiberias towards Jerusalem along the western bank of the stream, my thinking all propended to the ancient world of herdsmen and warriors that lay so close over my bridle arm. If a man and an Englishman be not born of his mother with a chiffney bit in his mouth, there comes to him a time for loathing the wearisome ways of society, a time for not liking tamed people, a time for not sitting in pews, a time for impugning the foregone opinions of men and haughtily dividing truth from falsehood, a time, in short, for questioning, scoffing, and railing, for speaking lightly of the very opera and all our most cherished institutions. It is from 19 to 2 or 3 and 20. Perhaps that this war of the man against men is like to be waged most sullenly. You are yet in this smiling England, but you find yourself bending your way to the dark sides of her mountains, climbing the dizzy crags, exulting in the fellowship of mists and clouds, and watching the storms how they gather, or proving the mettle of your mare upon the broad and dreary downs, because that you feel congenially with the yet unparcelled earth. A little while you are free and unlabeled, like the ground that you compass, but civilization is watching to throw her lasso. You will be surely enclosed, and sooner or later brought down to the state of mere usefulness. Your grey hills will be curiously sliced into acres and roods and perches. And you, for all you sit so willful in your saddle, you will be caught, you will be taken up from the travel as a colt from brass, to be trained and tried and matched and run. In this time, but first, come continental tours and the moody longing for the eastern travel. The downs and the moors of England can hold you no longer. With larger stride, you burst away from these slips and patches of free land. You thread your path through the crowds of Europe, and at last, on the banks of Jordan, you joyfully know that you are upon the very frontier of all accustomed respectabilities. There, on the other side of the river, you can swim with one arm. There reigns the people that will be like to put you to death for not being a vagrant, for not being a robber, for not being armed and houseless. There is comfort in that health comfort, and strength to one who is aching from the very weariness of that poor, dear, middle-aged, deserving, accomplished, pedantic, and painstaking governess. Europe. I had ridden for some hours along the right bank of Jordan when I came to the Jisr el Medjam, an old Roman bridge, I believe, which crossed the river. My Nazarene guide was riding ahead of the party, and now, to my surprise and delight, he turned leftwards and led on over the bridge. I knew that the true road to Jerusalem must be mainly by the right bank of Jordan, but I supposed that my guide was crossing the bridge at this spot in order to avoid some bend in the river, and that he knew of a ford lower down by which we should regain the western bank. I made no question about the road, for I was but too glad to set my horse's hoofs upon the land of the wandering tribes. None of my people, except the Nazarene, knew the country. On we went through the rich pastures upon the eastern side of the water. I looked for the expected bend of the river, but far as I could see, it kept a straight southerly course. I still left my guide unquestioned. The Jordan is not a perfectly accurate boundary betwixt roofs and tents, for soon after passing the bridge, I came upon a cluster of huts. Some time afterwards, the guide, upon being closely questioned by my servants, confessed that the village which we had left behind was the last that we should see, but he declared that he knew a spot at which we should find an encampment of friendly Bedouins, who would receive me with all hospitality. I had long determined not to leave the east without seeing something of these wandering tribes, but I had looked forward to this as a pleasure to be found in the desert between El Arish and Egypt. I had no idea that the Bedouins on the east of Jordan were accessible. My delight was so great that the near prospect of bread and salt in the tent of an Arab warrior that I willfully allowed my guide to go on and mislead me. I saw that he was taking me out of the straight route towards Jerusalem and was drawing me into the midst of the Bedouins. But the idea of his betraying me seemed, I know not why, so utterly absurd that I could not entertain it for a moment. I fancied it possible that the fellow had taken me out of my route in order to attempt some little mercantile enterprise with the tribe for which he was seeking, and I was glad of the opportunity which I might thus gain of coming in contact with the wanderers. Not long after passing the village of a horseman met us. It appeared that some of the cavalry of Ibrahim Pasha had crossed the river for the sake of the rich pastures on the eastern bank, and that this man was one of the troopers. He stopped and saluted. He was obviously surprised at meeting an unarmed or half-armed cavalcade. And at last he fairly told us that we were on the wrong side of the river, and that if we went on, we must lay our account with falling amongst robbers. All this while, and throughout the day, my Nazarene kept well ahead of the party, and was constantly up in his stirrups, straining forward and searching the distance for some objects which still remained unseen. For the rest of the day we saw no human being. We pushed on eagerly in hope of coming up with the Bedouins before nightfall. Night came, and we still went on in our way, till about 10 o'clock. Then the thorough darkness of the night, and the weariness of our beasts, they had already done 2 good days' journey in one, forced us to determine upon coming to a standstill. Upon the heights to the eastward we saw lights. These shone from caves in the mountainside, inhabited, as the Nazarene told us, by rascals of low sort, not real Bedouins, men whom we might frighten into harmlessness, but from whom there was no willing hospitality to be expected. We heard at a little distance the bawling of a rivulet, and on the banks of this it was determined to establish our bivouac. We soon found the stream, and following its course for a few yards, came to a spot which was thought to be fit for our purpose. It was sharply cold night in February, and when I dismounted, I found myself standing upon some wet, rank herbage that promised ill for the comfort of our resting place. I had bad hopes for the pitchy darkness of the night was a great obstacle to any successful search for fuel, and besides, the boughs of the trees or bushes would be so full of sap in this early spring that they would not easily burn. However, we were not likely to submit to a dark, cold bivouac without an effort, and my fellows groped forward through the darkness until, after advancing a few paces, they were happily stopped by a complete barrier of dead prickly bushes. Before our swords could be drawn to reap this welcome harvest, it was found to our surprise that the fuel was already hewn and strewed along the ground in a thick mass. The spot for the fire was found with some difficulty, for the earth was moist and the grass was high and rank. At last there was a clicking of flint and steel, and presently there stood out from the darkness one of the tawny faces of my muleteers, bent down too near the ground, and suddenly lit up by the glowing of the spark, which he courted with careful breath. Before long there was a particle of dry fiber or leaf that kindled to a tiny flame. Then another was lit from that, and then another. Then small crisp twigs, little bigger than bodkins, were laid athwart the glowing fire. The swelling cheeks of the muleteer, laid level with the earth, blew tenderly at first, then more boldly, and the young flame was daintily nursed and fed more plentifully till it gained good strength. At last a whole armful of dry bushes was piled up over the fire, and presently, with a loud, cheery cracking and crackling, a royal tall blaze shot up from the earth, and showed me once more the shapes and faces of my men, and the dim outlines of the horses and the mules that stood grazing hard by. My servants busied themselves in unpacking the baggage, as though we had arrived at a hotel. Sharif and his helpers unsaddled their cattle, and we had left the Tigris without the slightest idea that we were to make our way to Jerusalem, along the desolate side of the Jordan. And my servants, generally provident in those matters, had brought with them only, I think, some unleavened bread and a rocky fragment of goat's milk cheese. These treasures were produced. Tea and the contrivances for making it were always a standing part of my baggage. My men gathered in a circle around the fire. The Nazarene was in a false position from having misled us so strangely, and he would have shrunk back, poor devil, into the cold and outer darkness, but I made him draw near and share the luxuries of the night. My quilt and my pileses were spread, and the rest of my people had their capotes or their pileses, or robes of some sort, which furnished their couches. The men gathered in circle, some kneeling, some sitting, some lying reclined around our common hearth, sometimes on one, sometimes on another. The flickering light would glare more fiercely. Sometimes it was the good Sharif that seemed the foremost, as he sat with venerable beard, the image of manly piety, unknowing of all geography, unknowing where he was, or whither he might go, but trusting in the goodness of God, and the clenching power of fate, and the good star of the Englishman. Sometimes, like marble, the classic face of the Greek Misiri would catch the sudden light, and then again, by turns, the ever-perturbed Deathmetry, with his odd Chinaman's eye, and bristling terrier-like mustache, shone forth illustrious. I always liked the men who attended me on these eastern travels, for they were all of them brave, cheery-hearted fellows, and although their following my career brought upon them a pretty large share of those toils and hardships which are so much more amusing to gentlemen than to servants, yet not one of them ever uttered or hinted a syllable of complaint, or even affected to put on an air of resignation. I always liked them, but never perhaps so much as when they were thus grouped together under the light of the bivouac fire. I felt towards them as my comrades rather than my servants, and took delight in breaking bread with them and merrily passing the cup. The love of tea is a glad source of fellow feeling between the Englishman and the Asiatic. In Persia it is drunk by all, and although it is a luxury that is rarely within the reach of the Osmanlis, there are few of them who do not know and love the blessed chai. Our camp kettle, filled from the brook, hung doubtfully for a while, then busily bubbled over the sidelong glare of the flames. Cups clinked and rattled, the fragrant steam ascended, and soon this little circlet in the wilderness grew warm and genial as my lady's drawing room. And after this, there came the Chiboku, great comforter of those that are hungry and way worn. And it has this virtue. It helps to destroy the gene and awkwardness which one sometimes feels at being in company with one's dependents. For whilst the amber is at your lips, there is nothing ungracious in your remaining silent, or speaking pithily, in short. Enter with sentences, and for us, that night there was a pleasant and plentiful matter of talk. For the where we should be on the morrow, and the wherewithal we should be fed, whether by some ford we should regain the western bank of Jordan, or the fine bread and salt under their tents, or a wandering tribe, or whether we should fall into the hands of the Philistines, and so come to see death. At last, the greatest of all the fine sights that there be. These were questionings, not dull, nor wearisome to us, for we were all concerned in the answers, and it was not an all-imagined morrow that we probed with our sharp guesses. For the lights of those low Philistines, the men of the caves, still shone on the rock above, and we knew this by their yells, that the fire of our Bivouac had shown us. Bivouac. What a strange word. At length we thought it well to seek for sleep. Our plans were laid for keeping up a good watch through the night. My quilt and my pelisse and my cloak were spread out so that I might lie spokewise. With my feet towards the central fire, I wrapped my limbs daintily round, and gave myself orders to sleep like a veteran soldier. But my attempt to sleep upon the earth that God gave me was more new and strange to me than I had fancied it. I had grown used to the scene which was before me, whilst I was sitting or reclining by the side of the fire. But now that I had laid myself down at full length, it was the deep black mystery of the heavens that hung over my eyes, not an earthly thing in the way from my own very forehead right up to the end of all space. I grew proud of my boundless bedchamber. I might have found sermons in all of this greatness, if I should have surely have slept. But such was not then my way. If this treasured self of mine had built the universe, I should have dwelt with delight on the wonders of creation. As it was, I felt rather in the vainglory of my promotion, from out of mere rooms and houses, into the midst of that grand, dark, infinite palace. And then, too, my head, far from the fire, was in cold latitudes, and it seemed to me strange that I should be lying so still and passive, whilst the sharp night breeze walked free over my cheek, and the cold damp clung to my hair, as though my face grew in the earth and must bear with the footsteps of the wind and the falling of the dew, as meekly as the grass of the field. And so, when from time to time the watch quietly and gently kept up the languishing fire, he seldom, I think, was unseen to my restless eyes. Yet at last, when they called me, and said that the morn would soon be dawning, I rose from a state of half oblivion, not much unlike to sleep, though sharply qualified by a sort of vegetable's consciousness of having been growing still colder and colder for many and many an hour. And that was chapter 12. So I wonder what Alexander King is going to get into in the next chapter. But we'll have to figure that out next Tuesday. I hope you enjoyed episode 102. And if you liked it, if you found it educational, if you found it entertaining, would you please like, subscribe, and share, and pass it along. We'll see you next time. Happy Tuesday, everyone.
Cotton fields whisper tales of old, under the shadow of a moss-draped oak. Johnny Rep's footsteps, growing cold, far from fire, cannon smoke. Worn-out boots on haunted ground, trudging through the dusky mire. By candlelight, no victory found. Prayers unanswered in the wire. In the heart of Alabama, ghosts walking slow. Confederate soldier, nowhere to go. Battles fought and lost in the blood-red glow. In the heart of Alabama, whispers of woe. Magnolias weep in the midnight hour, gray coats drenched in heavy sorrow. Yesteryear's battles, fields devoured, promises of tomorrow, nobody to borrow. Worn-out boots on haunted ground, trudging through the dusky mire. By candlelight, no victory found. Prayers unanswered in the wire. In the heart of Alabama, ghosts walking slow. Confederate soldier, nowhere to go. Battles fought and lost in the blood-red glow. In the heart of Alabama, whispers of woe. Magnolias weep in the midnight hour, gray coats drenched in heavy sorrow. Yesteryear's battles, fields devoured, promises of tomorrow, nobody to borrow. Magnolias weep in the midnight hour, gray coats drenched in heavy sorrow. Yesteryear's battles, fields devoured, promises of tomorrow, nobody to borrow. River sings a mourner's tune, iron shackles neath the muddy tide. Crimson stains beneath the moon, southern pride swallowed deep inside. In the heart of Alabama, ghosts walking slow. Confederate soldier, nowhere to go. Battles fought and lost, neath the blood-red glow. In the heart of Alabama, whispers of woe.